Continuing the Varieties of Religious Experiences Studying Human Nature by William James. We are in lecture 17, I presume, but 16 and 17 are Mysticism. And we finished off last time with a quote, Strobe 10. In mystical literature, such self-contradictory phrases as dazzling obscurity, whispering silence, teeming desert are continually met. They prove that not conceptual speech, but music rather, is the element through which we are best spoken to by mystical truth. Many mystic scriptures are indeed little more than musical compositions. He who would hear the voice of nada, the soundless sound, and comprehended it, has to learn the nature of dharana. When to himself his form appears unreal, as do on waking all forms he sees in dreams, when he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound which kills the outer. For then the soul will hear and will remember, and then to the inner ear will speak the voice of the silence. And now thyself is lost in self, thyself unto thyself, merged in that self from which thou first didst radiate. Behold, thou hast become the light, thou hast become the sound, thou art thy master and thy God. Thou art thyself the object of thy search, the voice unbroken that resounds through the eternities, exempt from change, from sin exempt, the seven sounds in one, the voice of the silence. Om Tat Sat. And H.P. Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence. And I've shared that on this channel, so, and a comment to that on this channel. These words, if they do not awaken laughter as you receive them, probably stir chords within you, which music and language touch in common. Music gives us ontological messages which non-musical criticism is unable to contradict. Though it may laugh at our foolishness in minding them, there is a verge of the mind which these things haunt, and whispers therefrom mingle with the operations of our understanding, even as the waters of the infinite ocean send their waves to break among the pebbles that lie upon our shores. And a quote from Swinburne's On the Verge in a Midsummer Vacation, here begins the sea that ends not till the world's end. Where we stand, could we know the next high sea mark set beyond these waves that gleam, we should know what never man hath known, nor eye of man hath scanned. Ah, but here man's heart leaps, yearning towards the gloom with venturous glee, from the shore that hath no shore beyond it, set in all the sea. That doctrine, for example, that eternity is timeless, that our immortality, if we live in the eternal, is not so much future as already here and now, which we find so often expressed today in certain philosophic circles, finds its support in a here, or an amen, which floats up from that mysteriously deeper level. Compare extracts from Dr. Buck, quoted on page 398 and 399. We recognize the passwords to the mystical region as we hear them, but we cannot use them ourselves. It alone has the keeping of the password primeval. As a serious attempt, as I know, to mediate between the mystical region and the discursive life is contained in an article on Aristotle's Unmoved Mover by F.C.S. Schiller in Mind, Volume 9, published in 1900. I've now sketched with an extreme brevity and insufficiency, but as fairly as I am able in the time allowed, the general traits of the mystic range of consciousness. It is on the whole pantheistic and optimistic, or at least the opposite of pessimistic. It is anti-naturalistic and harmonizes best with twice-bornness and so-called otherworldly states of mind. My next task is to inquire whether we can invoke it as authoritative. Does it furnish any warrant for the truth of the twice-bornness and supernaturality and pantheism which it favors, I must give my answer to this question as concisely as I can. In brief, my answer is this, and I will divide it into 3 parts. Mystical states, when well developed, usually are and have the right to be absolutely authoritative over the individual to whom they come. No authority emanates from them which should make it a duty for those who stand outside of them to accept their revelations uncritically. They break down the authority of the non-mystical or rationalistic consciousness based upon the understanding and the senses alone. They show it to be only one kind of consciousness. They open out the possibility of other orders of truth in which, so far as anything in us vitally responds to them, we may freely continue to have faith. I will take up these points one by one. As a matter of psychological fact, mystical states of a well-pronounced and emphatic sort are usually authoritative over those who have them. They have been there and know. It is vain for rationalism to grumble about this. If the mystical truth that comes to a man proves to be a force that he can live by, what mandate have we of the majority to order him to live in another way? And he's abstracting, William James is the I in the footnotes here, obviously, to extract from weaker states and from those states which the books are full, where the director, but usually not the subject, remains in doubt whether the experience may not have proceeded from the demon. And just like things being called gods and goddesses, well, it doesn't mean that they're not true somehow. It's just the interpretation of them or such may not be quite as one person or the other says it. We can throw him into a prison or a madhouse, but we cannot change his mind. We commonly attach it only the more stubbornly to its beliefs. It mocks our utmost efforts as a matter of fact, and in point of logic, it absolutely escapes our jurisdiction. Our own more rational beliefs are based on evidence exactly similar in nature to that which the mystics quote for theirs. And the example of holding one's beliefs, Mr. John Nelson writes of his imprisonment for preaching Methodism, "My soul was as a watered garden, and I could sing praises to God all day long, for he turned my captivity into joy and gave me rest as well as on the boards, as if I had been on a bed of down. Now could I say God's service is perfect freedom, and I was carried out much in prayer that my enemies might drink of the same river of peace which my God gave so largely to me." And a Journal of London, no date, page 172. Our senses, namely, have assured us of certain states of fact, but mystical experiences are as direct perceptions of fact for those who have them as any sensations ever were for us. Dreams are real. They're just, not always as real in the same way that they're said to be real, right? Now, I talk more about that sort of thinking in the Eckankar responses, but the records show that even though the five senses be in abeyance in them, they are absolutely sensational in their epistemological quality. If I may be pardoned the barbarous expression, that is, they are face-to-face presentations of what seems immediately to exist. The mystic is, in short, invulnerable and must be left, whether we relish it or not, in undisturbed enjoyment of his creed. Faith, says Tolstoy, is that by which men live, and faith state and mystic state are practically convertible terms. But I now proceed to add that mystics have no right to claim that we ought to accept the deliverance of their peculiar experiences if we are ourselves outsiders and feel no private call thereto. The utmost they can ever ask of us in this life is to admit that they establish a presumption, they form a consensus, and have an unequivocal outcome. And it would be odd, mystics might say, if such a unanimous type of experience should prove to be altogether wrong. At bottom, however, this would be only an appeal to numbers, like the appeal of rationalism the other way, and the appeal to numbers has no logical force. the Submitters sect, for example, go way too far with that. Oh, my favorite number, this doesn't happen, this happens 20 times, so we have to kick verses out of the scripture because I wanted this to be 19 times. Not everything's 19 multiples, thank you very much. If we acknowledge it is for suggestive, not for logical reasons. We follow the majority because to do so suits our life. But even this presumption from the anonymity of mystics is far from being strong. In characterizing mystical states as pantheistic, optimistic, etc., I'm afraid I oversimplified the truth. I did so for the expository reasons, and to keep the closer to the classic mystic tradition. The classical religious mysticism, it now must be confessed, is only a privileged case. It is an extract kept true to type by the selection of the fittest specimens and their preservation in schools. It is carved out from a much larger mass, and if we take the larger mass as seriously as religious mysticism has historically taken itself, we find that the supposed anonymity largely disappears. We begin with even religious mysticism itself, the kind that accumulates traditions and makes schools as much less unanimous than I have allowed. It has been both ascetic and antinomianally self-indulgent within the Christian Church. Riesbrock, in the work which Maeterlinck has translated, has a chapter against antinomianism of disciples. H. Delacroix's books, Essai sur le mysticisme spéculatif en Allemagne au 14 mai siècle, Paris, 1900, is full of antinomian material. Compare also A. Jundet, Les Amis de Dieu au 14 mai siècle, Thèse de Strasbourg, 1879. 2. Compare, it is dualistic in Sankhya and monistic in Vedanta philosophy. Now, if you look at the political, amount of government control trends you have, the polytheism or pantheism tends more towards the extremes, from socialism and further left, and libertarian and further right. And, the furthest right, they say the National Socialism was fascism. Well, fascism is the furthest left. So, but monotheism and monotheistic tends towards the middle. Democracy, constitutional democracy, republic, constitutional republic, that's not the order right to left, but you know what I mean. I called it pantheistic, but the great Spanish mystics are anything but pantheists. I think some of them actually were, but yeah. They are, with few exceptions, non-metaphysical minds for whom the category of personality is absolute. The union of man with God is for them much more like an occasional miracle than like an original identity. Compare Paul Rousselat, Les Mystiques Espagnols, Paris, 1869, chapter 12. And, of course, we can also compare that with Surah 17 and 53 of Al-Quran. Which doesn't talk about the union with God, talks about the union of purpose, you could say. On my channel, I have that glyph, the state of absolute righteousness, you could say, when that's all that you are, is the red and silver bit, and the black bit is, undefiled knowledge. So, to put it in my own terms, you could say. How different, again, apart from the happiness common to all, is the mysticism of Walt Whitman, Edward Carpenter, Richard Jefferies, and other naturalistic pantheists from the more distinctively Christian sort. The fact is that the mystical feeling of enlargement, union, and emancipation has no specific intellectual content whatever of its own. It is capable of forming matrimonial alliances with material furnished by the most diverse philosophies, and provided only they can find a place in their framework for its particular emotional mood. And the Christian sort see Carpenter's Towards Democracy, especially the latter parts, and Jeffrey's wonderful and splendid mystic rhapsody, The Story of My Heart. Okay. We have no right, therefore, to invoke its prestige as distinctively in favor of any special belief, such as that in absolute idealism or in absolute monistic identity, or in the absolute goodness of the world. It is only relative in favor of all these things that passes out of common human consciousness in the direction in which they lie. So much for religious mysticism proper, but more remains to be told, for religious mysticism is only one half of mysticism. The other half has no accumulated traditions except in those which the textbooks on insanity supply. And we should refer probably to Shibli, who talks of Baghdad, who mentions that sometimes people are just so sane that people deem them insane. Because, honestly, people call people insane left and right about stuff they can't prove being other than good and true, at least for the person who's conveying it. Open any one of these and you will find abundant cases in which mystical ideals are cited as characteristic symptoms of enfeebled or deluded states of mind. Well, we now know that auras are actually light, heat, moisture, and magnetism, for example. In delusional insanity, paranoia, as they sometimes call it, we may have a diabolical mysticism, a sort of religious mysticism turned upside down, the same sense of ineffable importance in the smallest events, the same texts and words coming with new meanings, the same voices and visions and leadings and missions, the same controlling by extraneous powers. Only this time the emotion is pessimistic. Instead of consolations, we have desolations. The meanings are dreadful, and the powers are enemies to life. It is evident from the point of view of their psychological mechanism, the classical mysticism and these lower mysticisms spring from the same mental level, from that great subliminal or transmarginal region of which science is beginning to admit the existence, but of which so little is really known. That region contains every kind of matter. Seraph and snake abide there side by side. What to come from thence is no infallible credential. What comes must be sifted and tested and run the gauntlet of confrontation with the total context of experience, just like what comes from the outer world of sense. Its value must be ascertained by empirical methods, so long as we are not mystics ourselves. Once more, I then repeat, the non-mystics are under no obligation to acknowledge in mystical states the superior authority conferred on them by their intrinsic nature. In Chapter 1 of Book 2 of his work Degeneration, Max Nordau seeks to undermine all mysticism by exposing the weakness of the lower kinds. Mysticism for him means any sudden perception of hidden significance in things. He explains such perception by the abundant, uncompleted associations which experiences may arouse in a degenerate brain. These give to him who has the experience a vague and vast sense of its leading further, yet they awaken no definite or useful consequent in his thought. The explanation is a plausible one for certain sorts of feeling or significance in other alienists. Wernicke, for example, in his Grundrisse der Psychiatrie, Thiel 2, Leipzig, 1896 publication, we have explained paranoiac conditions by a laming of their association organ, but the higher mystical flights, with their positiveness and abruptness, are surely products of no such merely negative condition. It seems far more reasonable to ascribe them to inroads from the subconscious life as the cerebral activity correlative to which we as yet know nothing. And I mentioned the experience of Muhammad, his ascent. The thing about that is there was no bypassing of the mind, no bypassing of the body and the emotions. It was physically sound, emotionally sound, otherwise psychiatrically sound, and the other experience came in. So, you don't have to be, Yet I repeat once more, the existence of mystical states absolutely overthrows the pretension of non-mystical states to be the sole and ultimate dictators of what we may believe. The body has 50 chemicals that help produce some of these states. You don't have to turn to drugs. It's in your body. You just got to learn it. As a rule, mystical states merely add a supersensuous meaning to the ordinary outward data of consciousness. They are excitements like the emotions of love or ambition, gifts to our spirit by means of which facts already objectively before us fall into a new expressiveness and make a new connection with our active life. They do not contradict these facts as such or deny anything that our senses have immediately seized. They sometimes add subjective audita et visa to the facts, but as these are usually interpreted as transmundane, they oblige no alteration in the facts of sense. It is the rationalistic critic, rather, who plays the part of denier in the controversy, and his denials have no strength, for there never can be a state of facts to which new meaning may not truthfully be added, provided the mind ascend to a more enveloping point of view. It must always remain an open question whether mystical states may not possibly be superior points of view, windows through which the mind looks out upon a more extensive and inclusive world. The difference of the views seen from the different mystical windows need not prevent us from entertaining this supposition. The wider world would, in that case, prove to have a mixed constitution like that of this world. That is all. It would have its celestial and its infernal regions, its tempting and its saving moments, its valid experiences and its counterfeit ones, just as our world has them, but it would be a wider world with all the same. We should have to use its experiences by selecting and subordinating and substituting, just as is our custom in this ordinary naturalistic world. We should be liable to error just as we are now, yet the counting in of that wider world of meanings and the serious dealing with it might, in spite of all the perplexity, be indispensable stages in our approach to the final fullness of the truth. In this shape, I think we have to leave the subject. Mystical states indeed wield no authority due simply to their being mystical states, but the higher ones among them point in directions to which the religious sentiments of even non-mystical men incline. They tell us of the supremacy of the ideal, of vastness, of unity, of safety, and of the rest. They offer us hypothesis, which we may voluntarily ignore. But They offer us hypotheses which we may voluntarily ignore, but which, as thinkers, we cannot possibly upset. The supernaturalism and optimism to which they would persuade us may, interpreted in one way or another, be after all the truest of insights into the meaning of this life. Oh, the little more, and how much is it, and the little less, and what worlds away. It may be that possibility and permission of this sort are all that the religious consciousness requires to live on. In my last lecture, I shall have to try to persuade you that this is the case. Meanwhile, however, I am sure that for many of my readers, this diet is too slender. If supernaturalism and inner union with the divine are true, you think that not so much permission as compulsion to believe ought to be found. Philosophy has always been professed to prove religious truth by coercive argument, and the construction of philosophies of this kind has always been one favorite function of the religious life, if we use this term in the large historic sense. A religious philosophy is an enormous subject, and in my next lecture I can only give that brief glance at which my limits will allow.